Hello, I'm Laura. Welcome back to the sewing room, and I'm here today to talk to you about scraps and how they could save your next project if you're just a little short on fabric. Alright, I have a question for you. Can you see where I added an extra piece to this to get it cut out of a lot less fabric? Make sure you see the whole thing. I'm talking a lot less. This garment doesn't have a waist seam, so if I hadn't done this, I would have needed a whole length from top of shoulder to bottom of hem to get the piece I wanted. And instead, all I needed was two little skinny wedges about 8 inches long and 3 inches wide. The technique I'm talking about is called piecing, and a couple of things make it easier to do or make it look less obvious in your final garment. And first of all, it's if you have kind of a wild print, that can help. And in fact, I'll show you. This is pieced on each of the side seams. So there. And I can barely even see it myself, right there. And I'll show you part of why I had to resort to that for this particular garment, and some warning signs to look for if you know you don't want to do piecing. But piecing is probably about as old as sewing itself. It's really hard to imagine people always having exactly what they needed, especially very, very early days of looms. Looms were not very wide, so you really had to work within very narrow parameters of fabric, and so, you know, you had to piece. I was introduced to piecing as a modern technique in this book by David Page Coffin, Making Trousers for Men and Women, and he actually uses piecing to get enough fabric to cover the full shape of the crotch area of pants. And it's really smart. He also pointed out that if you cut your piece that you're going to piece from your selvage edge of your fabric, then you don't even need to finish those seams in any way. You can actually just use that as it is, which is great. And actually you could see that in one of mine. I did that on both of them, but in one it's more visible because that was the white edge of the selvage. So in this case, I was all excited to lay out my fabric and get my pattern going and get this project on the way, and I realized that my fabric was approximately 1 inch too narrow for how I wanted to cut it. And I was like, well, gosh, how much would I have to shorten it to still get the fabric I want? You know, I'm very short of stature, so sometimes I can get away with just shortening the whole garment. In this case, it is a bathrobe, and I do like to have them at least knee length. I found when I have them shorter, I don't like them as well. And so I really wanted to have the full length, so I ended up cutting piecings off of the cutoffs of a couple of other pattern pieces and was able to go about my merry way and end up with a robe that I'm really happy with. So I'm going to show you something to look for on the pattern for where you might be able to place your piecing really easily. Of course, there's David Page Coffin's, you know, following his lead and using it for the crotch and trousers or pants. Kind of an obvious one, but I'll show you some other ones. Alright, so I was super psyched to try this pattern. I believe it's from 1974, if I remember correctly. And what I liked about it was it does have that nice, you know, easy bathrobe vibe going on. I love a shawl collar, but I also love that it has darts for the bust because it just gives it a little bit more shape, and then kind of an A-line. If you look at the pattern pieces, you can actually see that even better. And what I like about that is it just gives me a sense of at least still having a nice, you know, shape that I think suits my figure. Because I want to feel pretty, even in my bathrobe. I don't want just the total, you know, straight cut, boxy bathrobe situation. So here's where I ran into trouble. I was already doing the shorter one. And again, normally I can kind of get away with shortening something a couple of inches, but this was a good 6 inches. Basically, when I lined up my pattern on the fabric, I had a little wedge sticking out of both my front and my back pieces. And here's where and why I ran into trouble. I wanted to cut basically as if I had 48-inch wide fabric, so that I had, I had a fold and it would be nice and easy, and basically would take one full length of the robe and one full length of the other half of the robe, and then get all my other little pieces kind of worked in here. The problem was my fabric was a lot closer to 44 inches. In fact, after shrinking, it might have been 43 inches wide. And the way this is cut, basically you need 2 full lengths from the shoulder to the hem, or the shoulder to the bottom of the pattern piece, plus another one for the back. So you have like 2 fronts cut like lengthwise along the fabric. What they've done here is they've cut the fabric and then lined it up so that it's actually 2 layers of fabric. So when you see this, you actually need twice as much in terms of the length of the fabric as it looks like here, which is a lot. It would be this whole piece of fabric plus this much more again, and I just didn't have that much. I was about 12 inches short. So knowing I was 12 inches short, but I was only 12 inches short of doing this full layout. If I could do this layout, then I had enough fabric. But what was stopping me was this was just a little too narrow. I had this edge kind of sticking out from the edge. So I did the layout just like this, with the little edges kind of sticking out. And then I was able to take offcuts from probably this area and just sew them onto these little corners so that I could fill in those corners and be okay. If you're wondering, oh my gosh, how did you get this piece? Well, I got it kind of in a funny way. I actually edged it in here, and that pretty much probably only worked because I was doing the shorter piece. But anyway, long story short, I was super happy to be able to finish my robe the way that I wanted, and I'll do a close-up again so you can see hopefully a little bit less shaky version of what that piecing actually looks like when it's all done. All right, again, close up on my finished inside of my robe. Here's the side with the white selvage. And again, this is taking the selvage edge and just adding it onto the main piece so that the fabric then steps out and is a little wider enough to catch this full A-line. And then on the other side, it looks like this. You really can barely see this because I didn't even need the full inch. It's basically coming out to the seam allowance. That's that selvage edge. That's the piece. And then most of the piecing is actually hidden under the hem. You can actually see it from here to here. You can barely see it. Let me zoom in. If you look very closely, you can see this is the actual side seam, and this is the seam for my piecing. Again, just this little tiny piece of fabric could have, in theory, caused me to need another probably 1.5 yards, maybe 2 yards of fabric to finish the piece. So instead, I could just take a little tiny edge. And from the front, even when you know it's there, partly because this fabric is already so deeply patterned, but even when you know it's there, you can just barely see it. There's the side seam, and there's my piecing seam. Now, another good place to add piecing, which I actually did this kind of by accident, is in the sleeve. And I actually, I already have a sleeve that I have altered quite a bit to add a little more room through the bicep. And as part of that alteration, there's actually a seam right down the center of the sleeve, and I love the way it looks, and then also it actually kind of makes the sleeve take up less fabric because it's much easier to place 2 thinner pattern pieces on your fabric than one sleeve. You'll notice as you get sewing that sleeves are actually enormous. They take a lot of fabric, and if you're splitting it in 2 anyway to get a little more room in the bicep, which I've done here, then you're already kind of ahead of the game in terms of saving a little fabric. And I didn't do this here because I didn't need to, but if you don't like a visible seam like this on the outside of your sleeve, another good place to save fabric is actually in the underarm area. If you're really, really close to being able to fit all your pieces, but there's just a little bit sticking out, you can basically treat it like the fork in the trousers in David Page Coffin's book, and just add a piecing right under the arm right here. You could also piece under the arm on the garment itself. That's a really great opportunity to save a little fabric. And in this robe, we also obviously have this large collar. This is not cut on to the piece. It is its own pattern piece. So if you were really just like, oh, I got everything except this undercollar piece, you could either piece for the undercollar. There already is a seam in the center back, which helps. You could either piece it, or you could actually use a totally different fabric in the undercollar area, because then when you're using and wearing the garment, that is not really going to show. So you can always kind of make a little bit of savings there too. One last little tip for piecing that to help you really like your pieces after you've pieced them. And this is especially important for things like curtains, but even clothes still want to hang a certain way. And so when you start thinking about where you want to piece, you don't just want to pick some place that you think won't be visibly obvious in the final garment. You also really want to try to find a vertical seam, and you absolutely must make sure that everything is very true to the grain line. So basically you want the piece that you're piecing to have a nice straight line on the grain line, and you want the piece you're piecing to be a straight line on the grain line. Now you could do that by cutting those pieces in nice straight grain lines before you begin, or you can also just sew basically along the selvage edge, and then it's going to be nice and straight because it's the selvage edge, hopefully. So those are two important things to remember. Make sure that you're absolutely on grain to help your piecing fit better, and then also choose those vertical lines are where you want to put your pieces. The exception is if you want to add an underarm gusset to a piece to get either to save fabric or because you just want one there, those are actually really great on the bias. So you want to cut that at a 45-degree angle to the rest of the garment, because that will make that area even more stretchy and comfortable to wear. If this is your first time stopping by, thanks for stopping. If this is not your first time, thanks for coming back. And YouTube, basically I'm going to ask you if you want to subscribe, and also I'm going to suggest a video I think you might like. Alright, thanks.